everyone, this is Natalie of the Alternative Belgium History channel, and today I want to explain to you and show you my favorite UNESCO World Heritage site or category or kind of building in Belgium at least. The Beguinage, or in Dutch we call it het Beguinhof. It's not a single site, it's a series of 13 sites in the Flanders region of Belgium. There are another 13 Beguinages in Belgium, and there are even a few in neighboring countries, France, northern France, which used to be part of the historical county of Flanders, and in the Netherlands. But first of all, what are Beguinages? We can best describe them as enclosed communities of religious women. We're here now just outside the Beguinage of Leuven or Leuven. You can see this long wall, making sure nobody could see inside, and especially men. Because men were not only not allowed to step a foot inside, they were not even allowed to look inside. The gates were closed, and the Beguine on guard duty would make sure that no unauthorized person would enter. Now, Beguinages might sound very similar to monasteries or convents with nuns, but it was very different. Both the architecture and the layout, as well as the inhabitants, the Beguines. Unlike Catholic nuns, they did not retire from the world outside the Beguinage. And even though they dressed similarly, Beguines were very different to Catholic nuns. They were lay women, and they did not have to take the same perpetual eternal vows. This means that they could leave the Beguinage whenever they wanted, for instance if they wanted to get married. Of course, while they were at the Beguinage, while they were a Beguine, they had to follow very strict rules, and they had to lead a very religious life. They were symbolically married to Jesus as long as they were a Beguine. Other differences with Catholic nuns are that Beguines worked for a living, as for instance a teacher, a nurse, or mending clothes. And that was often outside the Beguinage, so they were also allowed to leave the Beguinage for work. Besides working to keep the Beguinage running, they did of course also have religious duties. And that is why a Beguinage always had its own church. But compared to nuns, they did have a lot less daily religious tasks. A Beguinage was initially on the outskirts of a city, but of course these cities kept growing and they are now surrounded by the city. Beguinages are also usually close to a river to have access to water. Here in the Leuven Beguinage, the River Dele even runs through the Beguinage. There is another important difference between Beguines and nuns that I haven't mentioned yet, and it's a difference that you can still see today in the Beguinages. That Beguines did not have to live in poverty. They did not make a vow of poverty like Catholic nuns did and do. They brought their worldly possessions with them when they joined the Beguinage. For instance, furniture, art, jewelry. Many Beguines were daughters of wealthy families, and those with the means could live in their own house, some even with a maid. So very different to a nun who lived without any material possessions. So in most of these houses, just one wealthy Beguine was living. The others shared, and they lived together in convents within the Beguinage walls, like the one that you can see here. This was a perfect option for young girls in the Middle Ages, as their only options were really to get married very young or to retire from the world as a nun and live a very, very austere and strict life. Now this way they could hold off on marrying, but without living a secluded and austere life for the rest of their lives. Most people that visit Belgium, even if they are quite familiar with history and Catholic heritage, have never heard of Beguinages, and that is because it is unique to this part of Europe. The movement started back in the early 13th century in northwestern Europe and spread quickly. But the male church leaders did not like to see all of this happen. Pope Clement V even declared the Beguines as heretics in the 14th century. Groups of women living by themselves in constructions that did not fit the mold of the conservative Catholic Church was definitely seen as suspicious and even dangerous at that time. But for some reason, he made an exception for the Low Countries. It's not really confirmed why that was, but it's very likely that the Beguine movement in the Low Countries had some powerful supporters with the right connections. Plus, they did have to agree to have a male supervisor, a vicar, or another male member of the church, but even he was not allowed inside the Beguinage. Inside the Beguinage, it was the Grand Mistress who was the boss. Beguines are sometimes called the first feminists, but that might be a bit exaggerated because their entire life was at the service of a man, Jesus, but they did lead a fairly independent and emancipated life, especially considering that this movement started back in the Middle Ages. The Great Beguinage of Leuven is one of the largest surviving beguinages. Back in the 17th century, more than 360 women were living here, and is a typical example of a city beguinage, following a medieval street pattern like a small village. Another type of beguinage is the square beguinage, where all the houses are built around one central square or park. The most visited beguinage of Belgium, this one here in Bruges, is an example of this, but also the Onze Lieve Vrouw Turnhout beguinage in Ghent, even though that one, strictly speaking, is of a mixed type because it has a second row of houses behind the courtyard. Nowadays, the houses of most of the old beguinages are still inhabited. However, the residents are no longer Beguines. The very last Beguine already died in 2012, but even before that, there were no Beguines anymore in the Beguinages. The last Beguines lived in regular convents and monasteries. Many Beguinages, like the one in Ghent, are now private residences with often also some public housing. In Leuven, where we started, the complex is owned by the university and provides housing for students and visiting professors. The Beguinage in Bruges still has a religious function. There's an order of Catholic nuns that is living there. Thank you for watching this video on this lesser known but very intriguing part of our history, the Beguine movement and the Beguinages of Flanders in Belgium. Please subscribe if you want to be updated on new history videos.